Long before the name Vikings struck terror into the hearts of Europeans, Lindisfarne stood as a sanctuary of serenity and devotion. Known as the Holy Island, this small tidal island off the northeast coast of England was a jewel of early medieval Christianity, a place where faith, scholarship, and art flourished in a delicate harmony. Its story begins centuries before the infamous Viking raid of 793 AD, tracing back to its foundation by Saint Aidan in 635 AD, under the auspices of King Oswald of Northumbria. The island quickly became a focal point for the spread of Christianity in the north of England, its abbey not merely a religious centre, but a beacon of culture, education, and manuscript illumination. To the world beyond the North Sea, Lindisfarne was a shining example of monastic life at its most disciplined and pious. The monks who inhabited Lindisfarne lived according to a strict regimen, dedicated to prayer, study, and service. Their days were measured by the canonical hours, beginning before sunrise with vigils, followed by matins, lauds, prime, and so on, punctuating the day with prayer, reflection, and spiritual discipline. This rhythm was more than mere routine, it was an all-encompassing way of life. Beyond prayer, the monks engaged in manual labor, tending to crops, caring for livestock, and maintaining the abbey and surrounding structures. Their existence was austere yet purposeful, built around a sense of communal devotion that valued simplicity and humility above worldly pursuits. Among the most remarkable achievements of Lindisfarne were its contributions to scholarship and art. The monks were skilled scribes and illuminators, painstakingly copying and decorating sacred texts that would later become invaluable cultural artifacts. Manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels, created slightly later but reflecting the same monastic tradition, demonstrate the meticulous craftsmanship and deep religious devotion of the island's inhabitants. These texts were not mere books, they were embodiments of faith, with intricate illustrations, interlacing patterns, and vibrant colors that symbolized divine beauty. The abbey also served as a repository of relics, including the remains of early saints, which attracted pilgrims from far and wide. The spiritual and intellectual life of Lindisfarne was rich and multi-layered, producing a culture that was as much about knowledge and beauty as it was about piety. The geographic isolation of Lindisfarne contributed both to its serenity and, paradoxically, to its vulnerability. Separated from the mainland by tidal waters, the island was accessible only at certain times of day, which created a sense of seclusion and tranquility. The ebb and flow of the tides allowed the monks to feel removed from the conflicts and dangers of the wider world. It was a place where time seemed slower, where the outside world's chaos held little sway over the rhythm of prayer, labor, and contemplation. Yet this same isolation meant that Lindisfarne was ill-prepared for sudden intrusion. Its defenses were minimal, relying more on spiritual protection than on physical fortifications. There were no walls thick enough to repel a determined enemy, and the small monastic community numbered only a few dozen at most, armed only with their faith and perhaps rudimentary tools for self-defense. The economy of Lindisfarne was modest but sufficient to sustain its religious mission. The abbey owned lands on the mainland, producing crops and raising animals to feed its inhabitants. Monks engaged in trade, exchanging manuscripts, relics, and other goods with neighboring communities, creating a network of influence that extended beyond the island itself. The abbey's role in education cannot be overstated. It served as a center where novices learned not only religious duties, but also the art of writing, mathematics, and history. The intellectual output of Lindisfarne, though overshadowed in later centuries by grander abbeys, was a cornerstone of early medieval learning in northern England. Socially and culturally, Lindisfarne represented a microcosm of the larger Christian world. The monks were in regular contact with other religious centers, exchanging ideas and participating in the broader ecclesiastical debates of the time. Festivals, holy days, and pilgrimages punctuated the calendar, bringing occasional bursts of activity to the otherwise quiet island. Pilgrims and visiting clergy were welcomed with hospitality, reflecting the monks' belief in service and charity. This openness to outsiders, while spiritually virtuous, would later contribute to the shock of the Viking arrival. These same monks, accustomed to greeting strangers with kindness, were unprepared for the violent intentions of the raiders. The physical beauty of Lindisfarne also mirrored the spiritual devotion of its inhabitants. Its small beaches, rocky cliffs, and marshy inlets created a natural sanctuary, while the abbey itself, modest in scale but architecturally harmonious, rose as a symbol of divine order. Its walls were adorned with carvings and crosses, and the interiors were illuminated by natural light, creating an atmosphere of reverence and contemplation. The landscape and architecture combined to produce a sense of peace and permanence, an island removed from the temporal anxieties of the mainland kingdoms. Despite its seclusion, Lindisfarne was not entirely insulated from the political and military currents of the age. Northumbria, the kingdom to which it belonged, was a land of shifting alliances, internecine strife, and occasional conflict with neighboring territories. Yet within the abbey walls, the monks could largely ignore these struggles, dedicating themselves wholly to God. Their lives were insulated by prayer, study, and ritual, creating a fragile but resilient bubble of civilization that, in its innocence, made them unprepared for the violent intrusion that would soon arrive. By the late 8th century, Lindisfarne had achieved a reputation as a spiritual beacon of northern England. Its influence extended far beyond its small shores, impacting neighboring regions both culturally and religiously. The monks' devotion to scholarship, artistry, and piety had created a legacy that seemed enduring, almost eternal. And yet, it was precisely this combination of wealth, beauty, and isolation that made Lindisfarne a tempting target for marauders who sailed from the north. What the monks could not foresee was that the island, a sanctuary of divine contemplation, was about to become the stage for one of the most infamous raids in European history, a violent confrontation that would shatter the peace they had cultivated for over a century. In understanding Lindisfarne before the Viking attack, one sees more than a simple monastery. One sees a symbol of human aspiration toward spiritual perfection, intellectual achievement, and communal harmony. It was a place where faith and culture intertwined, creating a sanctuary that was both inspiring and vulnerable. The serenity of the island and the devotion of its inhabitants would make the horrors that follow all the more shocking, highlighting the stark contrast between a world of divine order and one of violent chaos. The calm before the storm was not merely a matter of geography or time, it was a reflection of a deeply ingrained way of life, a life that the Vikings would soon rupture with sudden and terrifying force. The serene world of Lindisfarne, with its chanting monks and quiet cloisters, was suddenly poised on the edge of unimaginable violence. In 793 AD, the tranquility of the Holy Island was shattered by the first documented Viking raid on English soil, an event that would echo through centuries as a symbol of the terror these Norsemen brought from across the seas. The arrival of the Vikings was not merely an isolated incident, it marked the beginning of a new era in European history, one in which coastal monasteries, wealthy settlements, and unprotected communities would face sudden and devastating assaults from agile seafarers whose reach extended across the North Atlantic and the North Sea. The Vikings who arrived at Lindisfarne came from Scandinavia, likely Norway or Denmark, regions already accustomed to harsh climates, rugged landscapes, and a culture that valued martial skill and seafaring prowess. These were not aimless marauders, but highly skilled navigators and warriors who had honed their abilities over decades, if not generations. Their longships, sleek and agile, were marvels of naval engineering for the time. Constructed of overlapping planks, they were light enough to be carried overland between rivers, yet sturdy enough to withstand the rough seas of the North Atlantic. This mobility gave the Vikings a terrifying advantage. They could strike suddenly, disappear just as quickly, and reappear elsewhere before local forces could respond. Lindisfarne, with its accessible tidal shores, became an ideal target for such an opportunistic assault. Hister. Ecal sources, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, provide glimpses of the shock and horror that accompanied the Vikings' appearance. The Chronicle describes the raid in stark terms, noting that suddenly came dreadful forewarnings over the land of Northumbria and miserably terrified the people. These were immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons flying across the sky. While these natural phenomena may have been interpreted as ominous signs, the underlying reality was that Viking longships had been sighted approaching the coast, their sleek hulls cutting silently through the waters under the cover of dawn or fog. For the monks, whose lives had been sheltered and rhythmically ordered, the sudden appearance of armed strangers on their shores must have seemed like an apocalyptic vision come to life. The initial moments of the raid would have been chaotic and terrifying. Unlike conventional armies, the Vikings relied on shock tactics rather than prolonged sieges. Their approach was sudden, swift, and brutally effective. Accounts suggest that they disembarked with minimal warning, wielding axes, swords, and spears, ready to overwhelm any resistance. The monks, mostly unarmed and untrained in combat, were utterly unprepared for such an encounter. The Vikings' method was systematic: strike first, seize treasures, and instill fear, ensuring that the defenders were paralyzed by terror. This tactical approach would become a hallmark of Viking raids for decades to come. The Vikings' knowledge of geography and tides further enhanced their strategic advantage. Lindisfarne is a tidal island, accessible from the mainland only at certain times, a factor that the Vikings could exploit. Timing their arrival with the tides, they could ensure a swift landing, a sudden attack, and a rapid retreat before any nearby Northumbrian forces could mount a defense. The Onk's familiarity with the rhythms of their island offered no protection against this cunning. To them, the same tides that had governed their peaceful lives became the very mechanism that allowed their destruction. The motives of the Vikings were complex, though often simplified as mere greed. While plunder was certainly a key factor, they were attracted to the wealth of monasteries, which often held gold, silver, and precious religious relics. Their raids were also driven by social, political, and environmental pressures in Scandinavia. Population pressures, limited arable land, and internal conflicts created incentives for expansion abroad. Raiding offered young warriors prestige, wealth, and a means to assert status within their own societies. Additionally, the Norse worldview, with its pantheon of gods that glorified martial skill and heroic death, made violent conquest a culturally sanctioned endeavor. To the Vikings, the attack on Lindisfarne was both practical and honorable, a chance to demonstrate prowess and secure material reward. The psychological impact of the Vikings' arrival cannot be overstated. For the monks and local inhabitants, the sight of these foreign raiders, foreign not just in appearance but in language, customs, and religion, must have been deeply unsettling. The Norsemen were pagan, worshipping gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja, whose rituals and beliefs were alien to the Christian monks. Their sudden incursion disrupted the familiar order of the world, creating fear not only of physical harm, but of spiritual desecration. The monks' carefully cultivated sense of security was shattered, replaced by a profound awareness of their vulnerability in a world where violence could strike without warning. One cannot ignore the cultural and symbolic significance of targeting Lindisfarne. Monasteries were not merely religious centers, they were repository, eyes of knowledge, art, and wealth. By attacking such a sacred site, the Vikings were not only stealing material possessions, but challenging the spiritual and cultural order of the region. The choice of Lindisfarne as a target demonstrates strategic and psychological acumen. The shock of desecrating a holy site amplified the terror of the attack, sending ripples of fear throughout Northumbria and beyond. News of the raid spread quickly, reaching other monasteries and communities along the coast, creating a climate of apprehension that reverberated across England and into continental Europe. The arrival of the Vikings at Lindisfarne also represents a turning point in European history. Before this moment, coastal communities in northern England had experienced relative security, with threats largely confined to local conflicts or sporadic invasions. The raid introduced a new type of warfare, one that was unpredictable, mobile, and devastatingly effective. It forced societies to reconsider their defenses, adapt to new threats, and rethink their relationships with distant regions and cultures. The terror of Lindisfarne would echo in subsequent raids on other monasteries, towns, and settlements, shaping the course of medieval European history. In conclusion, the arrival of the Vikings at Lindisfarne was far more than a simple act of robbery. It was a carefully executed, psychologically impactful, and historically transformative event. The monks, who had lived in isolation and devotion, were suddenly confronted by a world of violence and unpredictability they could neither comprehend nor resist. The longships cutting silently through the tide, the glint of weapons in the morning sun, and the alien presence of the Norsemen together created a moment of historical shock whose consequences would resonate far beyond the shores of a tiny island. The raid on Lindisfarne was the beginning of an era in which the Vikings would become synonymous with terror in the European imagination, and it stands as a stark reminder of how quickly the most peaceful places can be thrust into the chaos of human conflict. Morning of the Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD was the beginning of a horror that would forever stain the island's history. What had once been a place of peace, spiritual reflection, and scholarly pursuit became a scene of sudden and unimaginable violence. The attack was swift, brutal, and merciless, a calculated combination of military efficiency and psychological terror that left both the physical monastery and the spiritual lives of its inhabitants in shambles. This moment stands as one of the most infamous episodes in early medieval history, not merely because of the loss of life, but because it shattered the illusion of safety that monasteries, thought to be sanctuaries, had long enjoyed. The Vikings had carefully chosen their target, not by chance, but because monasteries were among the richest and least defended sites along the coast. Lindisfarne was a repository of wealth in the form of gold, silver, illuminated manuscripts, sacred relics, and fine textiles. For the raiders, it represented an opportunity for immense material gain. The monks, unarmed and unprepared, could offer no meaningful resistance. As the longships approached, carrying armed warriors clad in chainmail and carrying axes, swords, and spears, the scale of the threat became horrifyingly apparent. The raiders' weapons were designed not only to kill but to intimidate. Axes could cleave through wood, doors, and bones alike. Swords could slash with deadly precision, and spears allowed the raiders to strike from a distance, making escape difficult. Historical accounts, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later writings, give chilling glimpses of the events that unfolded. The Chronicle records that suddenly came dreadful forewarnings over the land of Northumbria, and miserably terrified the people, referencing the fear that struck both the monastic community and the surrounding populace. While some of these forewarnings are described as natural phenomena, such as immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons flying across the sky, the real horror was in the physical presence of the raiders themselves. The monks, who had dedicated their lives to contemplation and prayer, faced armed men who understood no mercy, no restraint, and no reverence for sacred spaces. The monastery, once a haven of divine order, became a battlefield almost instantly. The attack itself was both opportunistic and systematic. Eyewitness accounts suggest that the Vikings disembarked in small groups, overwhelming any attempts at defense with speed and coordination. Their method was one of shock, strike quickly, terrorize, seize valuables, and retreat before organized resistance could form. Doors were broken, walls breached, and the sanctity of the abbey violated. Monks who had been engaged in morning prayers or tending the scriptorium were caught entirely off guard, some hiding in terror, others attempting futile resistance. The sound of axes striking wood, metal and flesh, combined with the screams of the attacked, would have created a scene of utter chaos and horror. The slaughter of the monks was particularly brutal. Historical sources imply that those who could not escape were killed without hesitation. Some were likely hacked down in the abbey itself, others may have been chased across the island's shores, attempting to flee the overwhelming force. The Vikings' goal was not only to acquire wealth but to instill fear. By massacring the unarmed and devout, they sent a message to other monasteries and coastal communities that resistance was futile. This terror extended beyond the immediate moment. News of the raid spread rapidly, carried by word of mouth and by the few survivors, leaving a trail of fear throughout Northumbria and even to other parts of England and the continent. The desecration extended beyond human life. The Vikings destroyed sacred objects, burned manuscripts, and looted relics of saints. These acts were not simply about theft. They represented an assault on the spiritual and cultural identity of the community. The abbey's treasures, painstakingly gathered and created over decades, were carried off, melted down or lost. Manuscripts, some of which contained unique religious and scholarly knowledge, were defaced or destroyed, erasing centuries of human effort and devotion. Relics, which had drawn pilgrims from near and far, were desecrated, leaving the community spiritually bereft. This physical destruction mirrored the psychological devastation of the monks and the surrounding population, for whom the abbey had been a source of guidance, comfort, and inspiration. The psychological impact of the massacre was profound. For the monks who survived, whether by hiding, fleeing, or simply being spared, the trauma would have been life-altering. They witnessed the collapse of the world they had known, a world ordered by faith, discipline, and routine, replaced by one governed by sudden violence and uncertainty. Contemporary accounts describe the raid as an apocalyptic event, with chroniclers interpreting it as divine punishment or a forewarning of greater calamities to come. The attack on Lindisfarne shattered the notion that sacred spaces were inviolable and forced monasteries throughout Europe to reconsider their vulnerability. The massacre also prompted a crisis of faith for some. If God allowed such destruction to occur in his house, what did that mean for the spiritual order? Beyond the immediate island, the attack sent shockwaves throughout England and beyond. Coastal communities began to fear that they could be next. Monasteries began fortifying their walls where possible, and the perception of Vikings shifted from distant raiders to a looming existential threat. Lindisfarne, once celebrated as a center of Christian devotion, became synonymous with terror. Letters, sermons, and chronicles describe the horror in vivid detail, ensuring that the massacre's legacy would endure as both a warning and a historical lesson. In many ways, the Vikings' strategic success lay not only in the wealth they plundered, but in the psychological control they exerted over the wider region, demonstrating that no place, no matter how sacred, was beyond their reach. The human cost of the massacre was staggering. Although exact numbers are lost to history, it is reasonable to assume that a significant portion of the monastic community perished. Monks who survived may have been forced into exile, dispersing to other abbeys and carrying with them stories of the devastation. Families living in nearby communities, reliant on the abbey for spiritual guidance and support, would have also felt the loss acutely. In one fell swoop, Lindisfarne was transformed from a thriving religious and cultural hub into a cautionary tale of vulnerability, loss, and human cruelty. The massacre was not a mere raid, it was a catastrophic event that reshaped the social, religious, and cultural landscape of the region. Finally, the attack on Lindisfarne was emblematic of a broader pattern of Viking raids that would continue for decades. The tactics employed, speed, surprise, and psychological terror, became a model for future attacks on other monasteries, towns, and settlements. Lindisfarne's destruction served as a grim template, illustrating both the effectiveness of Viking methods and the vulnerabilities of medieval communities. The massacre's legacy endured not only in historical records, but also in the collective memory of Europe, influencing how societies prepared for and interpreted raids, how they constructed defenses, and how they reconciled with the idea of violence intruding into sacred and peaceful spaces. In conclusion, the attack and massacre at Lindisfarne was a moment of extraordinary violence, both physical and psychological. The Vikings' arrival shattered the peace of an isolated, devoted community, killing monks, desecrating sacred spaces, and plundering treasures that represented centuries of faith and scholarship. The horror of the day extended beyond the island itself, influencing European perceptions of Viking raiders and transforming monastic life forever. Lindisfarne would survive, eventually rebuilding, but the memory of that morning remained indelibly etched into history as a symbol of vulnerability, brutality, and the devastating consequences of human ambition and ferocity. Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793. A deed did not end when the raiders retreated to their longships. In fact, the assault's true impact began only after the echoes of violence faded, leaving a scar not just on the Holy Island, but on the collective consciousness of England and the wider European world. The aftermath was multifaceted. It involved human suffering, spiritual upheaval, political consequences, and a profound re-evaluation of security, faith, and cultural resilience. The destruction left by the Vikings revealed the fragility of communities that had long believed themselves protected by geography, faith, and tradition, forever altering perceptions of safety in medieval Europe. The immediate consequences for Lindisfarne were devastating. Survivors, likely scattered and traumatized, were forced to reckon with a shattered community. Many monks had been killed, and the physical abbey lay in ruins, its sacred halls burned or looted. Religious artifacts, priceless manuscripts, and relics of saints had been desecrated or carried away, leaving behind only the skeleton of what had once been a thriving center of faith. Those who remained faced the daunting task of rebuilding, but the psychological toll was as profound as the physical destruction. Fate, which had been a source of comfort and stability, was tested by the stark reality that even sacred spaces were vulnerable to human cruelty. Survivors may have questioned the divine protection they had long assumed, struggling to reconcile the attack with their understanding of God's will. The monks' displacement also had wider cultural consequences. Lindisfarne had been a hub of scholarship, art, and manuscript production, and its destruction meant an interruption in the continuity of these intellectual traditions. Monks who escaped may have sought refuge in other monasteries, taking with them the knowledge, skills, and manuscripts they could salvage. This migration, however, could not fully replace the lost cultural cohesion. Manuscripts and relics that were destroyed represented centuries of work and devotion, erasing irreplaceable links to the island's artistic and religious heritage. The impact of this loss was felt not only locally but across England, as Lindisfarne had been a point of reference and influence for other religious centres. The shock of the raid reverberated far beyond the borders of Northumbria. Coastal communities throughout England, and eventually in parts of Ireland and the continent, realized that no monastery, town, or settlement could be considered truly safe from the Vikings' sudden incursions. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Reports of the raid, carried by messengers, travelers, and surviving monks, painted a vivid picture of horror: sacred spaces violated, religious men slain, and treasures stolen. For many, the attack on Lindisfarne became a symbol of the unpredictable and ruthless nature of the world beyond the monastery walls. It shattered the illusion of divine protection, instilling fear that would linger for decades. Religious leaders and chroniclers interpreted the attack as a deeply significant event, both spiritually and morally. Many viewed it as a punishment from God, a warning to Christians to repent and reform. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other contemporary sources emphasized the apocalyptic undertones of the raid, framing it as a harbinger of divine judgment. This interpretation may have offered some spiritual solace, providing a narrative that made sense of the senseless violence. Yet at the same time, it reinforced the perception that the world was unstable and that monasteries, despite their sanctity, were not immune to worldly chaos. This duality of seeking meaning while confronting helplessness defined much of the European response in the years following the raid. Politically, the raid exposed vulnerabilities in the Northumbrian kingdom and other coastal regions. Leaders realized that their defenses were inadequate against the mobility and ferocity of the Vikings. Unlike traditional land-based armies, which could be mobilized to respond to local conflicts, the Vikings struck swiftly from the sea, often before news of their arrival could reach inland authorities. Coastal settlements, particularly religious centers, had been relying on isolation and perceived sanctity for protection. The attack demonstrated that strategic preventative measures were necessary, prompting the construction of rudimentary fortifications and greater vigilance, although it would take years and countless subsequent raids for communities to adapt to this new threat. The raid at Lindisfarne marked a turning point in medieval military thinking regarding coastal defense. The wider European world also felt the shockwaves of Lindisfarne. Monasteries across the continent were keenly aware of the vulnerability exposed by the Vikings' maritime mobility. The raid became a cautionary tale that spread quickly, influencing not only defense strategies but also religious and cultural discourse. Monasteries began to reconsider how they safeguarded their treasures, from relocating relics inland to reinforcing structural defenses. The perception of Vikings as both fearsome warriors and spiritual profaners took hold, influencing European attitudes towards Scandinavia for centuries. Lindisfarne's fate was not an isolated incident, but the first in a series of raids that would shape European history and consciousness. Economically, the aftermath of the raid had ripple effects. The plundering of wealth from monasteries like Lindisfarne deprived the local communities of resources that had been central to spiritual, educational, and charitable endeavors. The destruction of agricultural stores, manuscripts, and trade goods hindered the abbey's ability to sustain itself and its surrounding populace. For centuries, monasteries had served as centers of economic as well as spiritual life, and the sudden loss of assets created hardship beyond the immediate abbey walls. The economic shock forced communities to rethink the role of monasteries, not only as spiritual hubs, but as vulnerable repositories of wealth. In addition to the practical consequences, the raid profoundly affected the cultural imagination. The shock and horror of Lindisfarne entered the collective memory of Europe, shaping narratives about the Vikings for generations. Chroniclers and storytellers emphasized the suddenness, brutality, and sacrilege of the attack, reinforcing the image of Norse raiders as both fearless and ruthless. These narratives were not merely records of events, but became moral and cautionary tales, warning of the consequences of complacency and the fragility of civilization in the face of violence. Lindisfarne thus assumed a symbolic role, representing the vulnerability of even the most sacred and seemingly secure communities. Despite the devastation, Lindisfarne eventually endured. The process of recovery was long and arduous. The monks who survived rebuilt the abbey, though the scale and grandeur of its previous structures were diminished. Over time, the island continued to serve as a religious center, though the memory of the raid remained embedded in its identity. For Europe at large, the Lindisfarne attack prompted an enduring awareness of the Viking threat, influencing military, religious, and cultural responses for decades. It became a historical touchstone, illustrating both human resilience and the catastrophic consequences of violent intrusion into sacred spaces. In conclusion, the aftermath of the Viking raid on Lindisfarne was not limited to the immediate destruction and loss of life. It reshaped the spiritual, cultural, economic, and political landscape of Northumbria and reverberated across Europe. Survivors faced trauma and displacement, while other communities reconsidered their vulnerability to sudden attack. Monastic centers rethought their defenses, religious interpretations of the raid emphasized both punishment and moral caution, and chroniclers preserved the memory of the event as a symbol of both horror and resilience. Lindisfarne became an enduring warning that even the most sacred and seemingly secure places were not immune to the forces of human violence, and that the shockwaves of a single raid could influence the course of history far beyond the shores of a small tidal island. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD left an indelible mark on European history, reverberating through centuries as a symbol of both human cruelty and resilience. Its significance extends far beyond the immediate devastation of the abbey, the loss of life, and the desecration of sacred relics. Lindisfarne became a historical and cultural touchstone, a lens through which historians, theologians, and writers have examined the interaction between faith, violence, and societal vulnerability. The legacy of the raid is complex, encompassing religious, artistic, cultural, and political dimensions, as well as shaping the perception of Vikings in the European imagination for generations. At the most immediate level, Lindisfarne's legacy is tied to its role as a cautionary tale. The sheer audacity of the Viking attack challenged the medieval European belief that monasteries, as sacred spaces, were inviolable. For centuries, monastic communities had relied on their spiritual sanctity and relative isolation as protection against the unpredictable violence of the outside world. Lindisfarne shattered this illusion. Its destruction demonstrated that wealth, piety, or isolation were insufficient safeguards against determined and well-organized raiders. Subsequent coastal and riverside monasteries took note, adapting their defenses, relocating valuable relics, and instituting more rigorous security measures. In many ways, the raid forced a re-evaluation of the relationship between faith and practical preparedness, influencing monastic and civic planning for decades. The cultural and religious legacy of Lindisfarne is equally profound. The abbey had been a center of learning, manuscript production, and religious instruction. Though much of its material wealth was plundered or destroyed, the intellectual and spiritual traditions of the monks survived through migration and adaptation. Monks who escaped the island carried knowledge, skills, and devotional practices to other monastic centers, contributing to the broader preservation of Christian learning in Northern Europe. Lindisfarne's example underscores the resilience of human culture. Even when physical structures are destroyed, the ideas, practices, and spiritual frameworks nurtured within them can endure. In this sense, the abbey's influence extended far beyond its geographic confines, shaping the development of religious and cultural life across England and beyond. The raid also left an enduring imprint on the European imagination. Chroniclers of the time framed the attack in apocalyptic terms, emphasizing both the terror and the sacrilege involved. Phrases such as "fiery dragons flying across the sky" in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle evoke the sense of otherworldly dread that accompanied the invasion. These accounts contributed to a lasting perception of Vikings as both fearsome warriors and agents of chaos. Over time, the narrative of Lindisfarne became a symbolic reference point, a story told to illustrate the unpredictability of life, the fragility of human institutions, and the moral and spiritual lessons to be drawn from suffering. In literature, art, and historiography, the raid has been repeatedly revisited, its significance interpreted in diverse ways depending on the cultural and religious context of the chronicler or artist. Artistically, Lindisfarne's legacy is intertwined with the broader heritage of early medieval Christianity. The abbey had been renowned for its illuminated manuscripts and religious art, including the later creation of the Lindisfarne Gospels, which exemplify the island's artistic and devotional excellence. Though the original treasures of the abbey were looted, the aesthetic and spiritual influence persisted. The intricate designs, calligraphy, and iconography associated with Lindisfarne inspired subsequent generations of monastic artists and scribes. The raid, paradoxically, enhanced the mystique of these artistic achievements, casting them as symbols of a vanished, almost mythic world of devotion and creativity. In this way, Lindisfarne became a touchstone for the preservation of cultural memory, a reminder that beauty and faith could survive even in the face of destruction. Politically, the raid had implications that extended beyond the abbey itself. Northumbrian authorities, initially unprepared for maritime raids, were forced to reconsider their defensive strategies. While Lindisfarne's remote location and tidal isolation had once been considered protective, the vulnerability exposed by the Vikings' arrival highlighted the need for fortified coastal settlements and improved communication networks. The attack served as a warning not only to Northumbria, but to neighboring kingdoms and emerging European states. Over time, the threat of Viking incursions contributed to the development of more centralized military and administrative structures, as rulers sought to protect both their territories and the ecclesiastical institutions that were vital to cultural and spiritual life. In this sense, the raid acted as a catalyst for political evolution, reshaping the way early medieval societies approached security and governance. The spiritual lessons of Lindisfarne also resonated deeply. The massacre of monks and desecration of holy relics prompted theological reflection on suffering, divine will, and human mortal. Chroniclers interpreted the raid as a form of divine punishment or as a test of faith, framing it within the moral and religious worldview of the time. For the survivors and the broader Christian community, the event reinforced the fragility of earthly existence and the need for spiritual vigilance. Pilgrimages, prayers, and commemorations became ways to honor the victims and reaffirm faith in the face of violence. In this way, Lindisfarne's legacy contributed to the development of Christian thought on martyrdom, sanctity, and the moral responsibilities of both individuals and communities. Over the centuries, the memory of Lindisfarne has evolved into a symbol of resilience. The abbey was rebuilt, the community gradually restored, and religious life continued despite the initial devastation. Today, Lindisfarne stands as a historic site, its ruins and reconstructed structures serving as a testament to the endurance of faith and culture in the face of violence. Visitors and scholars alike reflect on the raid not only as a historical event, but as a metaphor for the vulnerability and strength of human institutions. The story of Lindisfarne invites reflection on how societies respond to crisis, preserve knowledge and culture, and maintain identity despite traumatic disruption. The legacy of Lindisfarne also extends to the broader historical understanding of the Viking Age. The raid marked the beginning of a series of similar attacks across the British Isles and Europe, establishing a pattern of seaborne raiding, looting, and cultural disruption. For historians, Lindisfarne represents a pivotal moment in this era, illustrating both the capabilities of Viking seafarers and the vulnerabilities of early medieval societies. The event also shaped European attitudes towards Scandinavia, influencing diplomatic, military, and cultural responses for centuries. The perception of Vikings as fearsome, unpredictable, and aggressive became deeply embedded in European consciousness, a narrative that persists in historical literature, popular culture, and academic scholarship to this day. In conclusion, the legacy of Lindisfarne is multifaceted, encompassing spiritual, cultural, political, and historical dimensions. The raid transformed a peaceful monastic community into a symbol of human vulnerability, challenged assumptions about the inviolability of sacred spaces, and catalyzed changes in defense, governance, and cultural preservation. The enduring memory of the massacre informs both historical scholarship and popular imagination, reminding us of the fragility of human institutions in the face of violence, the resilience of culture and faith, and the profound ways in which a single event can reverberate through centuries. Lindisfarne's story is not merely one of tragedy. It is a testament to the persistence of human creativity, devotion, and memory in the aftermath of catastrophe. Even as we remember the horrors inflicted by the Vikings, we also honor the enduring legacy of a community that, despite devastation, left an indelible mark on history, art, religion, and the collective imagination of Europe.